Tak to byl pan Carlos Moreno, já doufám, že jste si ho užili, že jste si vychutnali jeho projev. A teď už poprosím, a teď poprosím pana Jima Volkera, aby nám řekl zase on o tom, jak to tedy s těmi městy dělá, čemu se vlastně věnuje a co všechno dokáže pro města vymyslet a udělat on, protože má skutečně bohaté zkušenosti s tím, co se s městy dělat dá. My máme štěstí, že žijeme v Praze, což je na jednu stranu štěstí, na druhou stranu to možná takové štěstí není v tom kontextu, o jakém se tady dneska bavíme. Tak já už prosím pana Jima Volkera. Hello. So it's yours. So now it's gonna be your place. You enjoy and
I'll enjoy it.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to Petra, to the team, and to all of you for inviting me here today. This is actually only my second trip in 2 years to go anywhere, and I almost didn't imagine it was possible, because even yesterday it took me a whole day to get here. And tomorrow it will definitely take me more than 1 day, I think, to get home. But I feel that there is a real energy in the team, and there seems to be an energy in the city that says to me, now is the time for Prague. And I really wanted to make the effort to try and support you, to think about how we can turn your enthusiasm, your talents and your skills into something that will make Prague, let's imagine, the most walkable city in the Czech Republic. Maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe the most walkable city in Europe. Is it possible? Anybody? Or maybe the most walkable city in the world. Who thinks that's... Maybe you already think we're there. I want to share with you my thoughts, and this is the beauty sometimes of being a visitor, is that I can say some things that maybe are observations, experiences from other places that I can share with you that you may think are horrible to say, or things you don't want to hear. But I hope that tomorrow I'll leave. If you invite me back, I'll know that it's been okay. If you don't ever see me again, then I hope something you'll learn from the presentation. And I remember when I was last here, and I think it was at least more than 10 years ago, I had this picture, like many of you, of Prague, as they always say, it's so beautiful, it's so walkable. You could almost interchange these two words, and you could imagine that Prague is complete. It's finished. The place is full of people on foot. And therefore, have we achieved everything we set out to do? Or is there still more opportunity? And I want to be provocative with my thoughts here about whether just because people are walking, does it mean it's walkable? There are many places in the world, unfortunately, believe it or not, which are very walkable with nobody walking. And there are even more places where there is a lot of walking and no walkability whatsoever. We particularly have been working in Africa for the last 2 years, where there's literally millions of people walking every day and almost no walkability. And it makes me reflect about what is the opportunity in all the other countries. What can we learn from Africa in the way that we manage our cities? So what else can be done? We've seen this picture of COVID, and I share with you this because, like Professor Carlos said earlier, we are going beyond the Sustainable Development Goals. We were already busy. We knew what we needed to do about safety and equity and health. We need to keep it clean and sustainable. The language over the years has evolved, and it's important. But we've never been so relevant since COVID. We've never been so busy, because when communities are put under threat, the number one thing they want is a safe place to walk. It's become a global commodity. And being able to get for food, to work, to education, to healthcare, and to exercise. Communities all over the world will tell you that when you take that right away, as Petra said at the beginning, that when you take that right away, you suddenly realize how much you missed it, how much you valued it even. If you look at the European Commission vision for mobility in Europe, you would imagine that if we make our mobility autonomous, if we make everything electric, and if we make our vehicles safer, we're going to be fine. And I hope you don't fall into this trap, because that Holy Trinity is flawed. And because what we've learned, particularly I think because of COVID, is that people matter. Society matters. And just as Carlos put up in his slide, if we really want to think about the social element of our city, maybe we aren't managing everything equal around environment and economy, and it all has to be about growth, growth, growth. But maybe people, mental and physical happiness, well-being, is maybe more important than we realized 2 years ago. It helps, I think, to actually work out what it is, to define what we're trying to achieve. And I like this quote about what is walkability from a professor in the US who talks about trying to work out the extent that the environment supports and encourages people to walk. The extent means we've got to measure something. And ultimately, what we have to ask ourselves of all our communities is whether or not to walk here in Prague, are we giving people a reasonable offer in terms of the amount of time and effort that we're asking people to make? Is it reasonable? And you can ask that of yourselves, but you also have to ask it of your children, of your parents, of your grandparents, of your neighbors. And I think personally that that's the only measure really that matters, is to ask the question, to engage in the conversation, to actually decide whether or not what you think is reasonable is also reasonable for your neighbor. That common good that we just heard Carlos talking about needs to be interpreted into a language that is an exchange so that we understand what's possible. So let's think about how we might get there. We often talk about 8 steps to a walkable city. And if you do invite me back, I'm very happy to talk about those steps and think about how we might get there together. But for now, I'm going to give you the answers, and then we'll work backwards. Really, it's not rocket science. If you want a walkable city, the vision really just needs to start thinking about including all the people who are walking already, because very often we only think about the future of walking, or the concept of a strategy has to be about getting people out of their cars. We forget the fact that the glass is already half full. All of you walked here today, whether or not you put your hand up to that original question, because actually identifying the amount of walking already is really critical. But yes, there's always more that can be done to entice people to walk, particularly for short distance trips where they're currently being motorized. And so if we unpack that vision, then really we're asking for 3 key things. Now, I'm very happy to have a discussion about this, but we've looked at strategies all over the world, looked at lots of different countries, lots of cities, and these 3 things are common, that if we get these 3 things right, I think we'll be doing a good job. We keep people or retain people walking already, protect people from ever getting hurt, and enable people to walk by improving accessibility and comfort. Now, I have never met a politician anywhere in the world who wouldn't sign up and say, I want that in my city. So I'm sorry he's left, but I was going to put it to him. Please, would you want this? Do you want this in your city? Does this make sense to you? A few yeses. Let's think about what that means. So when we're talking about walking, I can share with you good data, European data, and I'm sorry you're not on it so much here on this particular chart. But what's helpful here is to recognize that 79% of people in Europe are walking to get to and from places already. And if we only measure modal share, which is often the way that we talk about, 32% of people walk in Prague, or 31.5, you miss the reality of the fact that most trips are being walked. And there is other data that you can use to think about that. If we're thinking about protection, it makes sense to me that we're thinking about the numbers of people who were killed, and we'll look at the data in a minute about Prague. But in Europe, 5,500 still every year, plus another 30,000 injured. And what's interesting is when you look at this map, is how the further east you go, the less safe it seems to be. Now, I don't know whether your data is good enough on there, but the darker the data, the less safe you are to walk. And that strikes me as something that is a question, whether we're doing enough, and why would that be like that, and what can we do, and how we should be targeting these countries to make sure that it's as safe everywhere as possible for everyone walking. And when we think about enabling, then this is a red carpet. And we've done this in a number of cities, put down this red carpet down the middle of the street. This is, does anyone know where this is? Recognize this? It's in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And they call it VIP Day, very important pedestrian. And it strikes me we could put a red carpet down the middle of almost any street. But it will be interesting to see the reaction you might get from a simple measure like this. Because when we did it, even in Copenhagen, one of the places where maybe you think it's the most walkable, maybe one of the most walkable places you might imagine in Europe, actually people walk on the side. They didn't imagine that the carpet was for them. They thought somebody important was coming. And it took them 3 days to realize that they were the important people. The short trips is critical, and generally, I forgot to mention on there, but 30% of car trips, interestingly, could be walked. I think in Prague it's nearer 40% actually, could be walked or cycled. And it's the same level of about people who are not active enough to benefit their health. But if you needed convincing, because quite often people say, well, give me the maths. If we haven't got the numbers, then we're not going to count these things. And I think over the course of today and tomorrow, you'll have many different speakers coming from different perspectives, sharing with you their understanding of walking from their disciplines. And I think what's interesting in these numbers is not just the total amount, which is an extraordinarily high amount for Europe, but actually how people have to work together. It's the interdisciplinary nature of walking is what makes it so fascinating, and what makes it so difficult if people don't talk to each other in different departments. Because as you'll see from here, yes, the benefits, most of the benefits are from health. Thank you to our Dr. Mayor for remembering that. And also in tourism, you know that. You know how empty these streets are right now and how full they normally are. But if transport doesn't lead and doesn't invest in the infrastructure, then none of those benefits happen. And so although they don't have the big budget, they don't have the big benefit, they do have the budget to make the difference. And that's why transport needs to take on the lion's share of the responsibility. Let's think about that then in a Prague perspective. What do we really need to know? And this is why our perspective is always putting the person at the center. This is the sort of the science, I guess, or the practicalities behind Carlos's conversations. We're thinking about actually, wouldn't it be great if we just had answers to these 6 questions? We'd probably know enough, wouldn't we? I don't know how much you know about Prague, but we have spent maybe 10 years looking at indicators talking to cities and countries all over the world about all the different things you could measure. There are certainly 36 things that would be great to measure and understand about walkability in any city. But the reality is that everyone's too busy. No one's got any new budget to go and measure anything new. And so we have to borrow existing data. Borrow data that exists, that gives us an insight and suggests to us whether or not we're doing a good enough job or where there may be some gaps. So let me quickly run through you some answers about these sorts of things that might be helpful to give us a baseline, as it were, about where we are in Prague, how that might appear in context, and give you an insight that might make you think, okay, there's still something to do. Activity. I would suggest to you that the best measure is not mode share. We know that 31% in Prague. But think about minutes a day. And if you knew how many minutes people are walking per day by gender, by age and ability, and by income levels, you'd have a much finer grained understanding about how people are moving in this city and what impact that you're having on their lives. Yes, if we look over the country data, you'll see that physical activity data, again, tends to suggest that in the east, there's more walking than in the west of Europe. And that can be divided down into much finer detail. But let me just give you a quick headline on the Prague data. From what I can understand, and there's a quote here from this data source, thank you for helping me, because my Czech's not fantastic, is that it seems, on average, we've got data that says about 3.1 kilometers per day is the average walking distance. And if you can convert that into some average walking speed, it's somewhere between half an hour, 37 minutes. It seems that women are walking a little bit less than men in Prague, but maybe we don't know enough. It's just a headline. But compare that to other places in the world, that's pretty low. It's not as much as you might hope. And the worrying thing is that it's probably going in the wrong direction. People tend to be walking less, but do we know enough about that? I won't go into all the health data, but I wanted to share with you maybe another bit of data that again exists, thinking about motorization. And this is quite critical because when we actually ask people, if you think about that conversation again, very often people will say, as soon as I can afford to, or as soon as there's a viable alternative, I'm going to give up walking because. And that list of becauses is really what's at the heart of this agenda. What is that because? Is it because there's not enough space? Is it because it's dirty, it's dangerous, it's just horrible? We have to define that horrible. Remember that reasonable. It's become unreasonable. And motorization is increasing here in Prague, I think, looking at the data, as fast as it is anywhere in Europe. And it's quite alarming. And just because those cars become electric doesn't mean it's going to get any better for a number of the variables that we've talked about. Safety. Well, I think one of the finer grained details is to actually understand how many pedestrians are being killed, because ultimately they are the most vulnerable, as we call them, the most valuable. We're all pedestrians, as you know, and there are measures that are out there that allows us to compare not just country data, but city data again and again to see whether or not it's actually safe to step out onto the street. And when you look at the road safety data, generally speaking, this is whether how things are going towards the 50% reduction target. And Czech Republic is about in the middle there, heading in the right direction of reducing road safety casualties, which is great. But when you look at the pedestrian data, it's still high, generally. And if we think about the number of deaths in 2020, it's about a third of all deaths in Prague are pedestrians. in 2020, looking at that data. And of course, on top of the deaths are injuries and those, serious injuries as well. And looking at the data, it seems to be children under 14 and those over 65 who are particularly vulnerable here in Prague. So what can we do about that? Let's think about that. And I think this, in many ways, the 15-minute reinvented, I guess, to some extent, into this wheel and thinking about the places that we always have to go, the main destination points. There is a sustainable development goal thinking about accessibility for public transport, and we can measure the 500 meters and the numbers of people who are within 500 meters of public transport. It's actually helpful to know. But if we were to think about that proximity we've just heard of from Carlos, we actually want to make sure the 500 meters around every hospital, every care home, every doctor's surgery, every place of worship, every school. We'll hear more about schools, I'm sure, later today. Doesn't it make sense? Every park, employment zones, retail areas, universities. Why have we never thought about the 500 meters, even around this building, just how walkable that is? And it's amazing when we travel how many different places find a focus. For example, in Gdansk in Poland, they said, well, look, we can't do everything, but we're just going to do schools. But they worked out if they just made the 500 meters around every school in Gdansk safe, it was actually 75% of their city would be walkable. So they could pass that policy because nobody was going to suggest that a child shouldn't be safe at school and getting in and out of their nearest school. When we look at the Czech data, and this is freely available. Generally speaking, most people are within reach of public transport. You're doing really well, actually. Almost higher, well, you're definitely higher than average. The average is about 65% of citizens are within reach of public transport. So this is an asset for you. People are within reach of public transport, within walking distance of public transport. So why are there any cars here at all? It doesn't quite make sense. If this means that it is within 500 meters, it's within a few minutes. Is it just that it's not nice enough? Or is it because that walk or the quality of that walking experience isn't good enough? I don't know. We have these broad level indicators because it gives us an understanding, but there are more questions obviously to ask, and that's, I think, the detail that I'm hoping that we can start thinking about together over the next few weeks and months. But comfort is certainly a key measure, and I think often the indicator, the most important indicator of thinking whether or not the things that you measure out on the street are actually good enough. Is there actually sufficient space to walk? Are there safe crossings? And what about the speed? Is the speed appropriate? And that's not necessarily what the speed limit is legally, or even necessarily the driven limit that's on the roads, but how it feels to be walking down that street and whether you feel you have to hold on to your child's hand or whether you're worried about them. That would be a very simple measure of whether or not the speed feels appropriate. These Paris details, as we saw from Carlos, they're unpicking that detail into really fine-grained understanding about infrastructure. And it will be helpful to think about a design guide, if it doesn't exist already, for Prague, to think about every neighborhood. Is it 57? You'd said to me that there were 57 districts here? 57. To think about how those standards might be the same or how they might differ across those areas. Number 5 of 6, as I said, was policy. And I put it as number 5 rather than as number 1, because we now know, because we did this in lockdown, we decided we could be on the internet and just research things if we can't walk anywhere and can't travel. We found that 50% of the world now does have a policy, some sort of policy that's saying the right thing, trying to do something positive for people who are walking. In Europe, 69% actually of countries have something. The green is that there is, and the blue is that there isn't. But just knowing that there's a policy doesn't mean that anybody's doing something with it. And so again, those steps are really trying to unpick about where the barriers are, what's actually stopping good words being turned into actions that you could definitely see on the ground. And yes, there's guidance. You don't need to read all this, but the thing is we have spent some time writing detailed guidance to help with the sustainable urban mobility plans, particularly for practitioners about walking, so that there is detail that means you're not in the dark. And I think there's more we can do in Europe about supporting a network. And I hope that you could be some big champions in that, thinking about working across Europe with other cities and countries over the next couple of years, because I think there's a real appetite for this that I think you could be strongly involved with. But to us, this COVID story has really sped things up. This is SlowCat data about who did what during COVID, and you'll see time and time again it was reallocation of road space, what they call opening streets, but giving street space that was for cars to people, and generally speaking around the world, 65% of this has been made permanent. And you'll see in Europe quite often walking improvements. And particularly the reason why I put this up here is because most of the actions happened in places where there was already a policy, where there was already a team, where there was already a commitment, and where there was already a budget. So COVID was an accelerator. It didn't start something new. It was an accelerator. And we saw a lack of action in places where they didn't have a policy. And so that's why policy is important, and COVID as an accelerator is something we really think is now's the time to change and think about what your ambition is and how you're going to deliver it if you haven't got that secure enough already. The final point and the final measure that we are really keen to promote is satisfaction. And the European Commission said to us, at the moment, they have a walking and cycling indicator, right? One indicator, we're allowed one measure for the whole of Europe. And they said for active travel, the one measure they have is the kilometers of cycle lanes. So there's nothing for walking, it's only the bike lanes. And I said to them, and they know this, that even the bike lanes, how do you know if the bike lanes are in the right place? What if no one's on them? What if they're horrible? But you're only allowed one indicator. And they said to us, well, what would you like for walking? And I said, satisfaction. I want to know whether people are enjoying the experience or not. Because actually, that's the ultimate measure. Because we can have all the right policy, we can see all these people walking, as we've said, we can see the numbers of people who are dying, but actually the best way to sort of save lives is to stop people going out there altogether. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And that measure has been suggested in some countries. So ask people where they like to walk and where they don't. And this, I know Lucia's here, I can't see you because of all these face masks, I can't see where you are. There you are. We're really delighted to be working with Lucia here to really thinking about how we can collect that data from people. It's in the App Store. It's something we, again, built with students during lockdown. But we're asking really these questions that originally started in Colombia and in Africa with lollipops. Walk around a street with kids with lollipops, with smiley faces or miserable faces, and say, put a sticker, put a lollipop down where you're not happy, where you think there's some sort of problem. And we've turned this into an app, a red, yellow, and green, and really try to create some categories, some common categories, which we would love you to help collect some data here in the Czech Republic, because over the next few months, it's being piloted in all these countries, not yet in the Czech Republic, but if you think that it would be useful to actually invite communities to actually collect data about their neighborhoods, and not just tell you what's required, but where it's required, we can then create a map of speed, for instance, and disaggregate it by gender, by ability, by age. Where are old people worried about speed? Where are the crossings in the wrong place, or they don't have sufficient time to cross the road, etc., etc.? I'm hoping that this tool could really disarm that sense of, well, we haven't got the data and we haven't got enough time to collect it, so we don't know whether we've got enough money or whether we're doing enough. I'll finish with this, which is my suggestion for what we do next. Because I think we're in a good place. The fact that we've got a room full of people, a commitment from the mayor, and some pretty good data. And I think over the course of the rest of the day and tomorrow, you'll have even more fine-grained understanding about how things are, who's doing what. And I think between you, you'll get a sense of what the opportunity still is. My number one would be to invite citizens, go to citizens to actually ask them about their walkability, about your walkability. Invite those responsible, like yourselves, to a workshop. I mean, we're here, aren't we? But I think we need to all roll up our sleeves and start getting involved in thinking about what we can contribute across those different disciplines. We've just translated the charter, thank you, into Czech, and we'll be putting it on the website. We have a map of the numbers of people who've signed the charter all over the world, and at the moment it's been signed by people in 87 different countries. But the more people who sign it on our website, the darker the color will be. And it'd be lovely to have a really, really deep, dark color for the Czech Republic about the number of people who are committed. You don't have to just be a mayor, This is a joint responsibility. The places that are being most walked, where we have best walkability, is where we have citizens with academics, with practitioners, with politicians. If you have all four, you're much more likely to be delivering. Collect the headline data. I've given you some insights. There'll be more. And I think the more you start looking, the deeper you'll dive, and you'll start asking questions about why is it like this, and our neighbors are like that. I think that's a good starting point. You have to, if you don't count it, it doesn't count. So we have to measure what we treasure, as we say. And I think these are things that we can really think about here in Prague. And ultimately, I'd really like to think of a signature project, something that would be transformative. You already have this beautiful city. You can't help but look out and think everything's perfect. But I suspect you know at least one street, if not a neighborhood, where there's certainly things that can still be done. And I suspect you'll know a bridge or a congested street, a place, maybe it's every school, as we were talking 2 weeks ago in Albania, every school where children at the moment are all dropped by car. You know, what if every school was a car-free zone? I said to the mayor, for an hour a day. And she said, not an hour a day, all day. I was like, okay, that's your privilege as a politician. But it gives us an opportunity to come up with something a little bit crazy, but preferably as crazy as possible, but as just as possible, as fair as possible, so that we make this city, yes, we talk about walking, but I don't expect you to have a walking department. That's not the goal here. The goal is that we all work together so that this language that we hear about, sustainability, livability, walkability, it's all our joint responsibility, and we do something together to really make it work. We created a map where we've started to plot who's doing what around the world. You're not on it yet, and I'd love to put you on it and think about who's doing design guidance, who's got a good policy, who's doing projects. I'd love to put you on this map. We're going to launch this later this year. I want the Czech Republic to be really visible on here so that you can learn from other countries and other countries can learn from you. Thank you very much for your time today.